Thanks for downloading this episode of the Mental Health Book Club podcast. And before we get started, I'd like to give a big shout out to Happiful Magazine, who were kind enough to sponsor me when I attended the Mental Health First Aid course for adults. If you haven't heard of Happiful Magazine before, they are a fantastic publication whose mission is to create a healthier, happier, more sustainable society, aiming to provide information, inspiring and topical stories about mental health and well-being. They want to break the stigma of mental health in society and to shine a light on the positivity and support that should be available for everyone, no matter their situation. You can get the e-magazine for free, or you can also get hard copies that are available. If you want to find out more about Happiful Magazine, head over to happiful.com. Hello and welcome to the Mental Health Book Club podcast with your hosts Sydney Timmins and Becky Lawrence. We would like to take this opportunity to let you know that we will be covering a diverse range of mental health topics that may be distressing to some listeners. You can find a full list of the topics being covered in each episode in the show notes. Please check the show notes before listening to any of our episodes. Welcome to the Mental Health Book Club podcast with Sydney Timmins and
Becky Lawrence.
And today we are going to be looking at Insane, America's Criminal Treatment of Mental Illness by Alisa Roth.
Amazon.com gives this book 4.3 stars, which is 16 reviews. Goodreads is 49 ratings and 15 reviews, giving it 4.04 stars. Sydney gave this 4 stars and I gave this 5.
And here's the book blurb.
An urgent exposé of the mental health crisis in our courts, jails and prisons. America has made mental health illness a crime. Jails in New York, Los Angeles and Chicago each house more people with mental illnesses than any hospital. As many as half of all people in America's jails and prisons have a psychiatric disorder. 1 in 4 fatal police shootings involves a person with such disorders. In this revelatory book, journalist Alisa Roth goes deep inside the criminal justice system to show how and why it has become a warehouse where inmates are denied proper treatment, abused and punished in ways that make them sicker. Through intimate stories of people in the system and those trying to fix it, Roth reveals the hidden forces behind this crisis and suggests how a fairer and more humane approach might look. Insane is a galvanizing wake-up call for criminal justice reformers and anyone concerned about the plight of our most vulnerable.
Today's episode is going to be about what we identified as second, which is courts and judges. So in essence, that's the justice system. And Becky has done a lot of notes and she's broken it down into 2 sections, which is
competency and NGRI, okay, which means not guilty reason of insanity. And so this is kind of the 2 different sections that mental health illness comes up really when you're going through the trial system. The difference between the 2 is, were you insane when you were committing the act? And that means that if you were, then that would be you're not guilty for reason of insanity. Whereas competency is, are you sane enough to be able to be put on trial, understand what's going on, be able to put your defence on properly, understand the proceedings,
understand that you have committed some kind of criminal act in the first place.
Yeah, and what the consequences for that act might be, and all of that. So that's what competency is. So these are 2 separate issues and slightly different parts of the system. So we'll do a competency first of all. And it is really interesting because not only is mental health put in this category, but also people with developmental difficulties.
And learning difficulties.
Yeah.
Which in some ways kind of is pretty different, isn't it?
Yeah.
I don't know. How can you classify the 2 in the same category? They're very I don't know, there may be some crossover, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But if you are someone with a mental illness, that doesn't necessarily mean that it inhibits your ability to understand what is happening.
And also, once you are medicated and maybe undergoing treatment, you might get to a level of sanity where you can understand the court proceedings.
Yeah.
Whereas if you have developmental difficulties...
I'm never going to understand who a judge is and what the defence does and what the prosecution does and all of those things. It's just not ever going to happen because I don't necessarily have the ability to learn those things and understand those things.
Yeah. And this goes all the way through all court systems. So even in the British system, because
the American system is mirrored in some ways on the English system, and then it's developed after. But the origins come from the same place. So you'll sometimes hear me talk about both. So William Blackstone, who writes basically all the books that found all of the English legal system. So if you go and study law, it will be it's Blackstone's rules, and that's what they call it. And he says that competency is crucial. You can't enter a plea where you say whether you're guilty or not if you do not understand.
Which is fair enough.
Yeah.
I completely get that. That makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah. If you don't understand the advice you're being given by your attorney, then you can't
fully understand
go through the process. You can't make a defense if you don't understand what's going on and how things worked, what you did, and
what the potential consequences are. Yeah, it's so much, isn't there?
And he says it's because you can't make rational decisions, so you can't defend yourself. Therefore, it's unfair to put you on trial. And this has been going on for a long time, and courts argue about what is sane enough to be put on trial.
And I understand why this may be the case.
Yeah.
Because it isn't black and white. It isn't like you can go and give someone a blood test or an x-ray or some other kind of test to find out whether they are at a level of competency that you can be put through the process.
Yeah. So the courts have come up with a two-part system, okay? And this came out of a court case that the US Supreme Court heard in 1960, which was Dusky versus the US. And it was where the plaintiff was too sick with schizophrenia and said that the trial that he had was unfair because at the time he didn't understand. So he was unfairly sentenced to 45 years in prison for kidnapping and raping a young girl. Okay. Now, whatever you think about the crime itself, his point was that he didn't understand the trial and he wasn't well enough to put his defence on properly.
Which is fair, I think, in this case.
Yeah. So judges now have two steps that they have to follow. They have to make sure that the defendant is orientated to time and place and has some recollection of the events.
So that means what exactly?
They've got to be able to understand where they are, what they're doing, and what happened. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Then they also have to have sufficient present ability to consult a lawyer with reasonable rational understanding. Right. Which basically means you've got to be able to converse with your lawyer and help him to build your defence.
Which, again, is fair enough.
Yeah. So all of that is what they have to do. And that's actually for a judge to do as well. And we'll come back to this again later on. But what made me maybe stop and think a little bit is a lot of these decisions, which are mental health medical decisions, really,
are being made by someone who isn't of the medical profession.
Yeah.
Who is in the judicial system.
Yeah. Who is trained as a lawyer who has become a judge.
And now they have to make medical decisions. You're not necessarily, don't get me wrong, judges, lawyers, etc., they're really highly trained in the things that they do. They didn't go to medical school. They shouldn't necessarily be making medical decisions.
Yeah. Now, the problem with this is that some people say that there are certain people who will never be sane enough to be put on trial if you put that whole thing in place.
Is it sane or competence? This is where I get confused. I found it very confusing.
Yeah, they talk about competence is sanity, is having sanity.
So this is why mental illness being put in the same category as learning disabilities and learning difficulties gets my head very confused, because I'm like, well,
competency seems different to sanity, and yet they're being placed in the same category.
Does that make any sense? Because that's what I tripped up on, and I kept rereading it, and so I'm quite enjoying this discussion because it's getting my head into what actually those mean.
Yeah.
But I could be competent because I have identified what is happening, but at the time I could have not necessarily been.
But then that is where you would be not guilty for reason for insanity.
Yeah, okay, got you. So let's try this again.
That's all right. That's why we do this. So yeah, it is kind of dividing up that idea of competency and sanity being similar in this case, even if we say that they might not be the same. And there are people who say that there are people in the system who will never be sane enough to be put on trial by the rules that have been put in place.
Which is, again, why I don't get this use of language of competency. Because it's not competent. It's the fact that their mental illness or their learning difficulty is stopping them from being able to engage fully with the process.
Yeah. And what they have now said is that actually maybe instead of being sane enough to follow all of these rules, like knowing why you're being charged, what crime, understanding the consequences, understanding the workings of the justice system, be able to communicate with your attorney in defense. If you can't do all of that, but you can do enough to get a fair trial, then that's okay.
Yeah, see, this is the other thing. I've heard cases where the individual has had something such as a personality disorder, such as borderline, and they have been convicted regardless of their mental health because they have been found to be competent.
Yeah, and it does seem that, especially if it's for a violent crime, mental health seems to then go out the window, and the fact that it's violent comes first. And we're going to see that actually some people have real problems when it comes to the not guilty by reason of insanity because of those things, especially. Yeah. Competency seems to be less of an issue, although we're talking about 50 to 60,000 people being evaluated every year, and about a quarter of those being found incompetent.
But again, it's them being put into this cycle of you must sit here and learn this stuff.
Yeah.
But you're never ever going to retain that information to be classified as competent. So what's the point?
Well,
I don't understand.
This is the thing. They have this restoration to competency. And this came in after 1972. So pre-1972, if you were found to be possibly incompetent, then
they just left it at that.
You were sent to a hospital.
Yeah.
And you were sent to a psychiatric hospital where you stayed. And you pretty much stayed indefinitely until a judge could decide that you were now competent enough to go on trial, or you're never going to be competent enough and you could be treated in the community. So now, post-1972, they put them through restoration to competency, which includes medication, but also...
Which is fair enough if you have some kind of mental illness.
Yeah.
If it is treatable by medication. And that's a case of trial and error. It's not going to be this quick, easy fix, is it?
No, and there is a criticism that actually sometimes people need therapy, and that's not necessarily provided. It's just medication.
You can't just be stuck on medication, feel better.
And then you're given a legal education where you are trying to be taught who the judge is, what the system is like. I mean, they were talking about how they watch Law and Order so that they can see what it's like.
Which is really quite funny.
Have mock trials. And there was one where they make up like some kind of game show where, yes, you're competent at the end. And I mean, Florida is spending $53,000 per defendant on this competency training.
When they could put that into therapy.
Yeah, it's $50 million per year. So this is a real issue, especially as the courts have said it takes a minimum of 6 months and often longer for people to go through the system. And there's even been people suing the system to say that they've been kept in this limbo of incompetency too long. And in 1972, they said it had to be a reasonable time. Now, 20 states in America have said that means less than a year. Because obviously, reasonable period of time is too vague a term. And states are actually allowed to decide.
Yeah, because let's be honest. Oh, you have to be let out in a reasonable time or some decision has to be made. Well, I'll make that 2 years or 3 years and everyone's going to be different.
Some states have said that is their maximum sentence for the crime they've been arrested for. Even though this whole fact that they're not competent means that they haven't had a trial. They haven't actually
So they would have to then go through the trial or some kind of decision about whether they were guilty or not. And then do they then have to then serve some kind of prison sentence after?
I wonder if that then their time before is considered that. Some states don't specify at all. In New York, if found to be not competent and you have been arrested for a misdemeanor, it's immediately dismissed. They don't even put you in the system because they said that you'll be in the system longer than you would be for the crime, so they don't. And there's even a backlog of waiting for places to then go into the restoration. So you're 6 months to a year of being in the system, trying to learn how to be competent.
But you've got to get into that.
You've got to get into that. And I mean, 2015, each month, 400 people in California were waiting for a place. So, and the average wait for that is a couple of months in LA. So it is about trying to then get yourself in the system. I mean, and actually in Washington State, whereas we've been saying, I mean, this is taking months or years, right? In Washington State, a federal judge has ordered the state to follow a state law which says that evaluating competency has to happen within 7 days. And if it's not, their state is fined $500 per prisoner. If it's longer than 7 days, then it takes $500. If it's longer than 14 days, then it becomes $1,000. And at the
so
moment...
have Washington State become bankrupt?
Well, they've paid $17 million in fines, and they're still not complying with this rule.
That's incredible.
Yeah. One defendant has been released from their maximum time without even being evaluated because they've been in there so long they've actually done their time, even though they've not been convicted, remember? So some competency wait for court proceedings. Then the other issue is that, so you go along and you become competent, right?
Magically.
Yeah. You go through and you are now understanding, you have been medicated, you're all better in what they're considering of better, and then you go to the trial. What if when you get to the trial, you then have another episode of mental health crisis and you then become incompetent again? You then get put back in the system. So some people have actually been in this cycle of system because actually it's really stressful, all of this. And stress, we know, is a big trigger. Some of the treatment is a big trigger. People are going to also be under strain for jobs, families, and all of that kind of stuff at the same time as going through a court system. So all of those stuff means that actually, if you've got an unstable mental health illness, then actually you can actually be in this cycle of I'm competent, I'm not competent, I'm competent, I'm not competent, I need evaluating, and then I'm better, and then I need evaluating again, and go round that cycle over and over again.
You know that little emoji that I like to use, which
well,
is
the
exploding
exploding
brain.
brain.
The exploding brain. That's how I feel right now, because this just makes my head hurt.
Yeah.
Because you just kind of go, I feel like that we're hitting our head against a brick wall with some of these things. You kind of go, why are we letting these people keep going through the cycle?
I think because we are obsessed in our society about you being responsible for your actions and you getting the consequences of your action. Now, some people are trying to put alternatives in. So, for example, in Fulton County Jail in Atlanta, they're actually trying to do an inpatient program where they're in jail and they do this competency training rather than having to go to a hospital, because that seems to be trying to wait for the places is what's taking time as well.
So competency training only occurs in the hospital setting?
At the moment, but this is an alternative where they're trying to maybe set it up in jails so that they can help.
Which would make more sense.
Yeah, and they actually linked in with Emory University, and so they had people from the psychiatry department at the university coming in and helping them. So it was all like, it wasn't all prison staff doing this, is what I'm trying to say.
Which we already have highlighted is an issue, is that these people that are not trained are then responsible for making these people technically sane.
Yeah. But although in Washington State, where they were trying to do the same thing, the ACLU affiliate actually filed a lawsuit to try and block the alternatives and say that it has to be done in a hospital environment. So even when they're trying to make these alternatives to try and make it faster at least, they are coming up against problems.
And really, the point is that you're trying to not necessarily make it easier for the jail and the prisons, but just treat these people that are going through the system with some kind of respect, that they're not just left in this limbo.
Yeah. A limbo that might be longer than the sentence you might do
in the first place that you've been arrested for.
Yeah. So it does seem to be quite difficult. And then the other thing is the not guilty by reason of insanity, which means that basically at the time that you were committing the offence, you weren't sane enough to understand your actions, to understand that what you were doing was necessarily wrong, not understanding the consequences of what you might do, those kind of things. You
might be experiencing a period of psychosis where there are some hallucinations or delusions that are impacting the way that you are behaving, for example.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's just one example of what might be considered.
And you might be over that episode now, so you might now be sane enough to be able to go put on trial, to be able to put your defence forward. You might be competent, okay, but you were insane at the time.
Right.
And obviously that's also very difficult to prove, and a lot of states are moving that proof over to the defendant. So the defendant has to prove they were insane at the time.
How do you do that?
Rather than the prosecutor having to prove that you were sane at the time.
How do you do that?
I'm not really sure.
Asking.
I think we'd have to ask a lawyer.
You look at that and you go, well, how can you actually prove to someone beyond reasonable doubt that you were insane at the time?
Yeah.
You haven't seen me at the time. You weren't there at the time.
Yeah.
How you could...
Some of the words you might use, you might be saying, oh, stop touching me, you alien, or something. I don't know. I don't know how it's done. But what I would say is the beyond reasonable doubt is an English system rule.
Okay.
In America, it's basically you've got to have a 51% idea that someone is guilty.
Really? Is that all?
Yeah. Whereas beyond reasonable doubt is more like 80%.
But then you can identify that these people... This is going to sound harsh. this person who is on trial, it may be pretty obvious that they're guilty, but how do you then prove that it was during some kind of mental health crisis?
Yeah.
When you weren't necessarily in control.
Yeah. And there's a perception that there's lots of these people going for this plea and that you're doing it because it's an easy way out and things like that. And there's a perception, a bit like The One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, that you're going to pretend to be insane so that you can get to be in a plush hospital rather than in a prison.
And don't get me wrong, there are people that do this. I understand that. And they are contributing to the stigma associated with this particular area.
But
and I completely understand why that might be a consideration. However, not everyone is the same.
Yeah.
Why are we putting this particular
thing
on
And you are sent to
everyone?
a psychiatric hospital. You're not sent to a plush hotel. Like, it's not as if just because you're not going to prison, you're suddenly going to, like, the best place ever.
You're going to have caviar and...
Yeah, it's still,
stuff.
And actually, in some psychiatric hospitals, you might be treated worse than you would in prison.
Yeah, depending on the institution, I guess.
So, and actually, the statistics tell us that between 0.1 and 0.5% of felony cases actually end up with this plea. So it's tiny.
Yeah. When
tiny.
you think about it, that is not exactly...
And only 10 to 60%, so let's say probably less than half of those, are successful. So we are talking about a very small amount of cases that actually use this plea. And we think that's mostly because when people are in this insane state of mind, this is where you often do find violent actions or threatening behaviour. And this is where people don't like the fact that somebody who has been violent might get let off in their eyes.
But it's not let off.
No, it's not.
And that's the key thing that I think people are missing. We're not necessarily turning around and saying, well, they're free to go. There is treatment. They're being sent to hospital.
And some states are actually putting in a guilty... even like you're guilty even though you were insane at the time, and therefore you still have to do your punishment.
Prison time.
Yeah. But I suppose you might get support in that at the same time.
But then when we look at prisons, they're not having the support. The support is not there. There's no money for it. There isn't the resources for it, etc., etc. So you're screwed if you do, you're screwed if you don't.
And some states have actually changed the law to say that if they have mens rea, which is intent, therefore if they had an intention to commit that crime, matter if they were insane or not, then they committed that crime. And so if you planned it, then therefore, you know...
Yeah, but I have borderline, and I plan certain things out way in advance because you have somehow really hurt me, and I hit back, and I probably would have planned it. That's...
Yeah.
I'd be in prison, I guess.
Well, that's when we come back to John Hinckley, who assassinated President Ronald Reagan, and he was convicted. He was sent to prison, even though at the time of the event he was under the delusion that if he did it...
Yeah, Jodie Foster would notice him.
But what they were saying is that actually he still intended to kill somebody for whatever reason, even if the reason was insane. And I completely agree with you. He was under a complete delusion. He was insane at the time that he did that. And there's several cases. I mean, we're talking, there's Jeffrey Dahmer, who killed 15 people, convicted. Lorena Bobbitt, which is mentioned in the book, cut off her husband's penis and was...
Hey, you probably deserve it.
But she was acquitted.
I'm sorry, that was a bit naughty.
She was acquitted.
She was acquitted, so it's fine to cut off a penis, but if you kill people...
Yeah. Andrea Yates, who drowned her children in a bathtub, which is really sad. She actually got convicted of their murder, and then she was acquitted on retrial. So there are cases
under a delusion, or she was going through a delusion at the time.
Yeah, there was a reason she did it,
and it doesn't make sense. There just doesn't seem to be any kind of black and white in their thinking or their processing about who is convicted and who gets to plead not guilty for reasons of insanity. They're just really... I don't know, maybe there is more stipulation. Again, we need an American lawyer to talk to us about this, because I don't fully understand.
Yeah.
Like, when you look at this, don't kill people, chop their penises off, it's fine.
Yeah.
Kill your kids in the bathtub, well, maybe not. Who knows?
Yeah.
There just doesn't seem to be any logic to this.
No.
And I don't know if that's because, again, the borderline is talking, because I like black and white, but there's no kind of grey... Yeah. Do you know...
But then that's part of our criminal justice system, and in America as well, is the jury system. And so the juries are unpredictable. You give them advice, the judge will direct them, but it's up to them to decide. And especially in America, when you've only got to have a 51% burden of proof, rather than whereas here it's like 75, 80%. So you've just got to convince that jury that you are 51% sure that person committed that crime.
Mm.
That is why I think we get a lot of discrepancies, because it's so low. You kind of, whereas 50% is 50-50, they could have, they couldn't. You've only got to get slightly above the 50-50 chance
for them to be convicted of a crime.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the reason why they have such a high conviction rate as well in America, because I think their burden of proof is too low. I mean, we do come from a system where it's much higher. But actually, some states have actually abolished the insanity defense completely. Kansas, Montana, Utah, and Idaho, which I don't understand. Others have introduced guilty but mentally ill, which was introduced to try and give the jury another option. So if the jury are told it's murder or it's manslaughter, they now have murder, manslaughter, or guilty but then insane.
Or mental illness. But then what happens if you are guilty, but that is as a result of your learning difficulty?
Well, that's
that would
considered
have to be,
the same.
It would go under mental illness?
Yeah.
Right, okay.
So, for a good one of the examples used in the book is in 2012, James Holmes shot and killed 12 people and injured 70 others in a movie theatre in Colorado. So, a really big, horrible
mass
crime.
shooting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He pled not guilty for reason of insanity, but he was convicted, and he was given 12 life sentences without any possibility of parole, which in America it's 100 years per person, so that gives you
well, he's never getting out.
1,200. They also added...
I don't get this. Because...
One life sentence should be enough.
Yeah. I understand that you're kind of trying to put the message out there that this is really bad. But he's never living to 1,000. No. I'm never living to 1,000.
And they had another 3,318 years for the 70 injured as attempted murder and filling his apartment with explosives.
So are they going to put his descendants in prison to mete out the rest of this? Because that doesn't make sense in my eyes.
No, it should be like the maximum maybe 150, because no one lives that long. Plus, when you're doing this, you're not a baby. It's not like you're born, which is why mostly it's 100 years, because by the time I think the oldest person in the world is like 120-ish. So unless you, I suppose, do this as a teenager. But it's an anomaly. I'm not sure where it came from or how it happened, especially as our life sentence is 30 years, which, although in our country, the Chancellor has to approve your release. So if at 30 years they still think you are a danger to the community,
won't let you.
You can lengthen that, so then it can become the whole life. Although they're meant to be stopping that under EU law, but obviously with Brexit happening...
Who knows what's going on?
What was interesting in this case, and the quote I wanted to bring out of this, was one of the mothers of the victims, which must have been awful, okay?
Yeah. It's understandable. This is a nasty situation.
She turned around and said, "I don't care if he's mentally ill or not. That's irrelevant to me. He wanted to kill people and managed to do it, so he should be held accountable." And I think that's kind of the viewpoint.
That's the mentality of people, yeah.
And I think that kind of sums up where they're coming from, that actually mental health illnesses are not an excuse for committing a crime.
I don't think that they are an excuse for committing a crime, because it's not like they're going to go skipping off happily into the sunset with rainbows and unicorns. That doesn't happen.
No.
Anyway.
And this also, it varies so much from state to state. It varies so much from state to state. Now, there are some judges and courts that are starting to do things a little bit differently. So, for example, Steve Leffman, who is a judge in Florida, tries to divert people into a criminal mental health project. So basically, if you're arrested for a misdemeanor or a non-violent felony, you could be diverted to treatment rather than into the court system.
So, for example, with the guy that we met at the very beginning of the book, who was in the lift.
Oh, yes.
Completely naked.
Yeah.
He wouldn't have gone into the jail and prison system. If he would have just gone into this...
If he'd accepted the treatment.
Yeah. And which I think he probably would have.
80% of the people that they ask say yes.
Well, why wouldn't you? It's a bit silly not to in some respects.
And they have connected this project with mental health care, housing in the community, and you appear in court on regular places to talk about where you are and what you're up to, and
and how well you're doing. And you can be kicked out of the system if you don't follow the rules. Someone took drugs into one of the housing institutes which went against the rules, so they were put back in the justice system.
Which is fair enough.
Yeah. And they currently have about 600 referred every year, and the caseload is about 125 people at a time, because obviously you have people dropping off after that. But it does divert those people out of the justice system and into the help that they need to try and stop this cycle. And it does seem like a pretty good system that this judge has set up. So really pleased that Steve was able to do that. In other places, they have actually got a mental health court. Now, this is more like just if it's got a mental health stance, you're put in a different room, basically. It doesn't actually change. The judge has no other training than he would usually have. And these people come in front of him, they talk about what they've done, and there might be some mitigating circumstances, there might be training plans and stuff they can do. But it's pretty much just to try to change the environment that it happens in rather than actually the outcome, from what I understand. So that's kind of the court system.
Right.
Which the amount of people who are stuck either in the I'm not competent or in the waiting in jail for a trial, and also all these things trigger mental health illnesses. So you end up with a lot more. But the worst part of all of this that I read about was the part where Alisa talks about the capital punishment. Now, we don't have capital punishment, and we haven't for a long time. And I don't believe myself in capital punishment.
I think in some ways it's worse for the individual if there is, and they understand what they've done and things, to in some ways live with what they've done. However, I don't agree with capital punishment because I don't think it is any kind of deterrent to people.
I don't think we have the right to take people's lives. I don't think that's the case. And
I guess
I'm a pacifist.
Yeah,
so.
I guess the other argument is that nor did the person who's committed a crime in the first place.
And that's why they're in jail.
Exactly.
Or prison.
Or wherever it is. Yeah, because here it's jail, so it gets confusing for us. But you can kind of, I don't know. It's just, I'm against it.
But then you've got to pay for people to be in the system.
I know.
And so I can see why some people...
It's definitely... Yeah. You can definitely see, in some ways, both sides of the argument.
Yeah, I think it comes down to why do we put people in prison? Do we put people in prison because it's a punishment? Do we put them in there to protect the public? Or do we put them in there...
to rehabilitate them?
Yeah, because if you're killing people, that's not rehabilitation.
No.
In any shape. You can't.
That is just punishment.
Yeah.
And the whole system started off in the first place to be, in some ways, a deterrent and a punishment to prove to others around, look, if you do something, you're going to end up like these guys.
Yeah, but then it evolved.
Here they are. To being something more about rehabilitation, which is fantastic. However, we've seemed to have taken this giant step backwards where we are, again, punishing people because there isn't the resources available to treat them.
Yeah. And there's some really interesting documentaries on the BBC about people on death row.
And there's quite a few on Netflix and Amazon and wherever you get your streaming services.
And Channel 4 had an interesting one recently about solitary confinement as well. So overall, really good documentaries out there. But when it comes to mental health, it actually goes against the 8th Amendment to actually kill somebody for as punishment for act when they were insane or are insane at the time that you are doing it. And this doesn't matter if it's competency or insanity, okay? So the US Supreme Court in 1986 said that people with mental health illnesses should not be subjected to capital punishment because it violates the 8th Amendment. And this comes down to the fact that even if you commit murder, okay, which is often what people have done to end up on death row, if you don't understand that this is a consequence, then you're just killing somebody.
Yeah, they don't understand. There's no point to it, really.
Yeah, you're just getting rid of them. It's kind of...
It's an easy way out.
To me, it's almost inhumane.
It is inhumane.
And they even had a case there was 2 law cases which jumped out at me when I was reading it. One was Roper versus Simmons in 2005, where the court had to actually say it's unconstitutional to execute juveniles. So no killing kids. The other one was that in 2002, Atkins versus Virginia said you can't execute people with developmental disabilities. All right. And even though, so we've had 3 court cases saying you can't kill mentally ill, you can't kill children, and you can't kill developmental disabilities. And yet...
we're still doing it. America is still doing it.
Between 2000 and 2015, half of those executed had a mental health illness.
However, do we know if that was at the time of committing an offence?
But they're saying it doesn't matter.
True, just generally. And that might be because of the treatment that they have been put through whilst they've been in the justice system.
Yeah. I mean, in California, in 2014, they started constructing an inpatient psychiatric unit for the men on death row.
Which should then indicate that those people shouldn't be put to death.
Now, California do actually explain that it takes 20 to 30 years sometimes to actually get to the point where you are put to death.
But using your argument that you've just said before, if they're needing to be put into that psychiatric treatment, then that should stop the process.
Yeah,
because
California is saying as long as they're sane when you do it, that it's okay.
You just said that it doesn't matter.
I know.
According to the constitutional stuff.
Yeah. So they're saying, this psychiatry is for getting them better so that they can then kill them.
It's the irony.
And maybe it's because I don't believe in it. Maybe it's because we've never
But it's a bit ironic,
though.
When you think about it, logically, it is ironic that you're getting someone better to then just end their life.
But they do. I mean, death row patients often go to hospital to get treated for things that are killing them, for cancers, for injuries, for things like that. And then they're put back into death row to live out until... And the thing is also, a lot of pleas come through, a lot of petitions against their crime. And so sometimes there are stays of execution. There are people who are then moved down to life without opportunity for parole. So there are appeals that actually do go through. So I suppose you've got to kind of keep them alive and keep them going until the process is stopped. I mean, sometimes that call happens when someone's been walked down to the table.
Sod that.
I couldn't imagine being on death row. I couldn't imagine killing anyone, but it is... I do believe that we should be
accused as well, and you ended up on death row.
Well, I mean, one of the reasons that Britain doesn't do it is because there were so many cases where afterwards people found out things
that they were innocent and didn't commit the crime in the first place,
and they've had to be, declared innocent posthumously.
Yes, that's an odd word.
It is. I like it though. So. That is kind of the justice system done.
From this book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It raises some really important issues, and I think it raises a lot of things that I think are also going on in the UK system.
Yeah.
So I think maybe not to the extremes of America because of the guns and because of the capital punishment, but on the actual treatment within that, below all of that, I think there are a lot of reflections and not some nice ones.
No.
So, yeah. I thought the book was very full on in revealing all of this stuff.
That's why I found it quite hard, I think.
Yeah.
So after that, I think I'm going to go have a lie down in a darkened room.
I've got tea and cake.
Oh, but maybe I won't. I think I'll be having tea and cake instead then. So, yeah, we'll leave it there for today. The next episode that we will be uploading for you to listen to is about the prison and jail system. So you will understand a little bit more about that and some of the issues that
Alisa
found in the system. So until next time, it's okay not to be okay.
And if you're not okay, talk.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Mental Health Book Club podcast. If you need additional help with your mental health, please contact the Samaritans on 116 123, which is a 24-hour helpline. And if you need additional information about mental health issues, please visit Mind at mind.org.uk. Our next episode will be part 3 of Insane, America's Criminal Treatment of Mental Illness by Alisa Roth. Our next episode with the Secret Psychiatrist will be on forensic mental health. Our next book will be If I Could Tell You How It Feels by Alexis Rose. If you'd like to find out more about the MHBC podcast, please visit our website, mentalhealthbookclub.com. We really hope that you enjoy this podcast, and we would like to hear what you think. Please head over to Twitter and follow us at MHBC_podcast, or head over to Facebook and follow our Facebook page, which is Mental Health Book Club. If you would like to show your support further, please share us with your family and friends and leave us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts.